Thanks for joining us for part 3 of the story of Lance and RuthAnn. Lance finally got off the plane, and when I asked him what took so long, he said something about there being some elderly woman in front of him who was taking a long time and he was waiting for her to get off the plane, but I didn't quite believe him. So I turned around as we were walking away to see if anyone else got off the plane, and I didn't see anyone, and the rest of the crew still hadn't got off the plane. So anyway, that's what was taking him so long. So I took him over to his brother's house, and we hadn't told anyone what we were doing that day. And he asked his brother, "Will you stand up for me? We're going to get married today." And his brother said yes. So I left him there with his brother, and I went over to my friend's house, and just we were getting everything ready. Lance and his brother showed up later, and we got married. And he was in town for the weekend. We hadn't really planned for any of this, so we just went to Denny's after we got married, and that was our after wedding meal. So he spent the weekend in town and he went back to San Diego. We hadn't really planned for any of this, so I had things that I needed to take care of before I joined him in San Diego. So it took about a month, and then I talked my parents into letting my baby brother drive with me to San Diego. He had just gotten his permit, so he drove out with me to San Diego. It took us 2 days to get there, and he spent a few days with us and got to know Lance a little bit. And then he went home, and Lance and I were still not alone because we had a roommate, which is not an ideal situation for newlyweds, but that's the way it was. I was recovering from my car accident, so I had physical therapy 2 to 3 times a week, and Lance was working. He was actually in school. So we didn't get to see each other very often. He had duty every 4 days. And then eventually I ended up getting a job and we were working opposite shifts. So we really didn't see each other then. A few months after I got out there, he was ready to finish school. And so it was time to get his orders. And we were so excited talking about, ooh, where could we go? This is something that we had talked about for a long time because we both loved adventure, we both loved to travel, and we loved exploring new places. When he got his options for orders, the only two places that we could go were San Diego or Japan. If we had gone to Japan, then I couldn't have gone with him because we didn't have children and there wasn't housing available for me. And we would have had to wait 2 years. And we said, no way, we're not doing that because we'd only been married for a few months. So he chose the orders to San Diego, and he went down to the ship to see what was going on, where his work center was going to be, and all of those details. And he came home and he was really upset. The ship was deploying soon after he finished school. And it ended up being 7 months after we got married that the ship deployed for 6 months. We missed so much during that time. Anniversary, our first anniversary, birthdays, and holidays. There was so much that we missed. And we spent a lot of money with me sending him care packages. We wrote letters to each other. We had a video camera at home that I sent video letters to him, and he borrowed one from someone on the ship and he sent video letters to me. And then he would call me whenever they pulled into port. And it would always be in the middle of the night because they're on the other side of the world. So I would get these random calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I would just be so happy to hear his voice. And I didn't care. It didn't even matter if I had to work that day. As long as I got to talk to him, that was all that mattered. And we would talk as long as we could, but usually there were people waiting to use the phone. So you can't be rude and just take up all the time. And he came home just before Christmas, and we were so happy to finally be together. I had finished up my physical therapy. I was doing so much better, and I was able to get around more. And so we went out and we bought hiking shoes and we bought some trail maps for the area. And that was going to be our plan. But first, they were deploying for a a short 2-week deployment, which is what they usually do after they get back from a long deployment. So a month after they came home from that 6-month deployment, they were gone for 2 weeks. And then we were all ready to start our life together finally. And he came home and he'd been having this pain in his right leg for a long time. And they had just been giving him ibuprofen to help with it. And they just kept thinking that it was maybe a sports injury because he was an athlete and he worked out a lot and he played a lot of sports. And the ibuprofen stopped working. So they sent him from the ship to Balboa Hospital. And he came home. It was late. I was wondering where he was because I didn't even know that they were sending him for this appointment. I had no idea about it. And he came home and he's telling me all about it. And in the middle of telling me, the phone rings and it's the doctor at the hospital. And he said, you need to get back to the hospital right away. There is something really wrong with your leg, and we are not ruling out bone cancer. Oh, by the way, your leg could break at any time, so have your wife drive you back. And Lance says to him, are you serious? My wife is standing here with me right now. She just heard all of that. And now you need her to drive me back to the hospital. But that's what we had to do. So we went down to the hospital. He ended up spending a month in the hospital while they ran the tests and they did a tissue sample of there was a tumor in his right femur. And they sent that off for testing. And it was determined that he had Langerhans Cell Histiocytosis, which at the time was just classified as an autoimmune disease, a rare autoimmune disease. It wasn't until many years later that it was actually reclassified as a rare blood cancer. His surgery was scheduled. And of course, it ended up being on the day that Lance and I had tickets to see Billy Joel and Elton John. I had always loved Billy Joel, loved them both, but Billy Joel was my absolute favorite. I had all of his cassettes when I was a kid, and I couldn't believe that we had the opportunity to see Billy Joel in concert, and bonus that Elton John was going to be with him. And Lance and I both loved music so much. We were fortunate enough to get tickets on the floor of Jack Murphy Stadium, and it was just going to be this incredible concert. And when we told his doctor that, his doctor said, well, can't reschedule the surgery, but you can give me the tickets and I'll go to the concert. We're like, yeah, I don't think so. So we ended up not being able to go to the concert, and they did surgery to put a titanium rod in his right femur. When they got in there to do the surgery, there was so much of the bone missing. They ended up having to do extra surgery and do bone grafts from his pelvic bone to that right femur. And so the surgery took longer. He ended up being under anesthesia longer. And when I went in to see him after the surgery was over, I walked into that room and his eyes were closed and he was so gray. I've never seen anyone that gray. I thought he was dead. And he opened his eyes and he saw the look on my face and it scared him. And I had to quickly recover and just try to be as strong for him as I could. He really hated being in the hospital. So he convinced his doctors to let him come home 2 days after that surgery. He couldn't even walk. He could barely even use the crutches to get around. And we lived in a 2-story townhouse. He couldn't get up the stairs. So I had already bought a recliner for him that I had delivered to our townhouse. And that was where he slept for the first couple of days. And then he said, this is too uncomfortable. I am determined to get upstairs. And so he got on his crutches and I stood behind him and I followed him up the stairs and he made it up the stairs. And then every day we'd get him back down to the main floor. And that's where he would sit all day unless he had appointments, therapies, whatever he had to go to. And he would just sit and watch TV. And while he was watching TV, it was spring training at the beginning part of this. And I thought, oh, great. We get to watch baseball because I married an athlete and I'm not an athlete. And he loved watching sports on TV. So when we first got married, it was football season, then it was basketball. Now he's wanting to watch baseball, but the one thing that he watched all the time on Sundays was golf. And I just remember that from the very beginning was, oh my gosh, it's Sunday. We have to watch golf again. And one day when he was on duty while he was still in school, I was watching it for an hour before I realized I was watching golf. And I actually grew to enjoy Sunday golf on TV because it was just so calming. But after all these other sports, I'm thinking, do I really have to watch another one? But the poor man has just had major surgery and he can't walk. So I pulled up a chair and I sat down next to him and I started asking him questions. And that was when I learned about baseball and I grew to love baseball. And that turned out to be a really big thing for us. It took him 3 months of physical therapy and exercises and just all the hard work before he could walk unassisted. He graduated from the crutches to a cane and then from a cane to nothing. And his doctor would not allow him to drive again until he could walk unassisted across the room. So he did it and he was able to start driving again and regain some of his independence. Life was getting back to normal. We had moved into a lower level single story apartment and that was working out much better for us. He was getting around better. We were starting to feel hopeful that he was actually going to be able to finish out his career in the Navy. And 6 months after that surgery, he ended up with diabetes insipidus, which is not the sugar diabetes, it is water diabetes. So we had bottled water in California. Everyone we knew had bottled water because the drinking water just wasn't good. And they came in 3-gallon jugs. He was going through an entire 3-gallon jug a day, and anything else we had in the refrigerator or the pantry, he was drinking it all. And I kept saying, I don't think this is normal. I think you should go to the doctor. And he kept saying, no, 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 no. It's probably just something weird going on right now. It'll pass. Well, after about a week, he finally agreed that he needed to get into the doctor to get tested. And that's when they discovered it was diabetes insipidus, which required a synthetic hormone because there was something wrong with his pituitary gland and he no longer made the hormone that regulated the amount of water in his body. And he was told then that this was a guaranteed discharge from the military because he was no longer forward deployable and he was pretty devastated. So about 3 months, maybe about 2 to 3 months after that diagnosis, we were still waiting to see what was going to happen with the Navy, when he was going to get out. Things had kind of stalled. And so we decided it was probably a good idea for me to move and get a job and get an apartment and get us settled somewhere so that when he got out, we were just ready to go. So I moved twice because I moved to one place and couldn't find a job. I gave it about 6 weeks. And then I packed up and I moved back to Denver and got my old job back. And so we ended up being separated then for 5 months while we waited for him to get out of the Navy. And he got there finally, and he wasn't working. I wasn't making much money, and we're trying to save money however we could. So we ended up giving up our life insurance because we thought, well, when he gets a job, we'll be able to get a better policy or a new policy, whatever. But little did we know. He did end up finding a job. It wasn't paying very much. And so he continued to look. And a few months later, he found the job that he really wanted. And he was so excited. And within a couple of weeks, he was having some problems. His energy level was just nothing. I was surprised that he was able to even get up and go to work, but he would go to work and he would come home and he would just go to bed. And that's all he was doing was sleeping. And so they finally tested him and the test showed low testosterone. And then a year after his discharge from the Navy, we found out that we couldn't have children. And that was the same month that my best friend and one of my sisters had children. There were 7 people in our life that were close to us who had children that year. From there, it was a pretty slow decline for about 9 years. He was able to work in the civilian world, and I worked part time so that I could maintain the house, the cars, and whatever else needed to be done so that on the weekends we could enjoy our time, because all that he could manage by then was working Monday through Friday. It was very hard to do any extra activities when he got home. He was pretty much exhausted. In fact, I have a lot of pictures of him sleeping on the couch during that time because he would just come home and he would sleep. During that 9 years, he ended up having surgery on his skull because there was a lesion that they found on his skull that was very painful to him. And they described this surgery as it was just on the bone. It wasn't in his brain, it was just the bone. But in order to get to it, they had to cut an S-shaped curve so that they could open up the skin a little bit better and get in there. And he always had this S-shaped scar on the back of his head after that because he loved wearing his hair short. We moved 4 more times during that 9 years to 2 different states because we were just trying to find a place where he felt comfortable. He just never felt well, and the weather really affected him, especially humid environments, because he had a lot of bone pain. And I remember he would just sit and he would rub his legs constantly because his bones always hurt. Then 11 years after the first diagnosis, things were changing a little bit. He would just kind of veer off when we were holding hands, and he'd regain his balance really quick and look at me like I have no idea what that was. But he did it at random times. It wasn't just a one-time thing. And then there were times that he would use the wrong word, and he would stop himself and he would say, that wasn't the word that I was looking for. And it would take him a second, but he would realize what word he actually needed. But that was something that was very new, and it was unusual for someone in their early 30s. So that began a whole new set of tests, and it took several months, and he was diagnosed with Erdheim-Chester disease, which was in the same family of diseases. So we already knew about this disease, and we knew that it was very serious. And that was when all the treatments really began. He started interferon treatments then. Those were pretty debilitating. I ended up quitting my job at that time because he wanted to continue working. So I stayed at home and I drove him to work and picked him up every day because those treatments just made him so sick. And he would sleep on the way to work and he would sleep on the way home. And that was basically all that he could manage at that time, was just going to work Monday through Friday. We didn't do anything on the weekends anymore. We weren't spending time with people. It was just him working and me taking care of the house and taking care of him. And that was it. And then they put him on a different treatment. That one didn't really do much for him. So about 7 or 8 months later, they put him on a different treatment, and it was a chemo pill and high dose steroids. And he seemed to be doing better on that. So I went back to work. I found a new job. And within a few weeks of starting that job, we found out that he was actually going to continue on the treatment, and I needed time off of work. And my bosses were so good about letting me have off whatever time I needed. But Lance ended up having to quit his job a year after that diagnosis because he just couldn't manage it anymore. It wasn't safe for him, and it wasn't safe for the people around him. And it was killing him slowly. He just didn't have the energy for it. So he stayed at home. I continued working for another year and a half. When he retired from his job, he was 37 years old. A year and a half later, when I quit working to stay at home as his full-time caregiver, I was also 37. When I was 39, I became his legal guardian because he was starting to show signs of cognitive decline, and it wasn't safe for him anymore to be driving or to be making decisions. And I did that to protect him and to protect me. After I became his legal guardian, we made some changes because we had both become very depressed because our life had changed so rapidly. And we went from being very active and social to basically hiding out in our house and not going anywhere. So we did our best to live, not just exist for the next 10 years. We did that in between appointments, in between everything that was going on. And we thoroughly enjoyed our life together. He passed away when I was 49 years old.
Listening to you recount the stories of you and Lance and your life together from beginning to end makes me aware that not everybody gets the opportunity to tell that story from the beginning to the end. You were the survivor of the relationship. And while you carry an enormous burden in having the ability to share that, the beginning and the end, you also have the privilege of being able to look back on a life well lived. So not everybody gets that either. I know this is hard for you talking about all this, reliving it, sharing it, but I'm so thankful that you're able to share this, not just with me, but with everyone. Knowing how many people are going to be blessed by your story is so exciting and so overwhelming and so humbling. Anyway, I'm really proud of you for being able to walk through this with us.
Well, Jenna, I thank you so much for doing this with me. I really did need you here to hold my hand through it because it was really hard. It was hard reliving it, but it was also amazing. I did get to relive all those good times too. And the good times are what remind me why I stayed and why I cared for him to the level that I did. I had people ask me a lot during the last decade of his life, why do you stay? And the story that I just told, I think explains that.
Well, I'm very proud of you. I'm honored to be able to walk through it with you. And I'm so excited to see how telling this story brings life and healing and comfort to what I believe will be many people.
I hope so. I have always intended to use my story in some way. I just didn't know what that looked like. So I hope that this is helpful to many. And thank you so much for joining me, Jenna.
It's been my honor.